Some houses are not abandoned. They are simply waiting for the right soul to return. The road to Black Hollow Lake disappeared beneath fresh November snow as Caleb Mercer guided his rusted Ford pickup through the northern Montana wilderness, the headlights cutting pale tunnels through the storm like fading memories trying to survive the dark. Beside him sat Ranger, the 6-year-old German shepherd who had once worked military search operations overseas and now spent most days watching the world with the quiet caution of something that had seen too much to ever fully relax again. The dog's silver-gray coat caught flashes of passing light while his amber eyes remained fixed ahead, alert, listening, as if the woods themselves were whispering warnings only he could hear. Caleb tightened his grip on the steering wheel and glanced toward the folded envelope resting on the passenger seat between them. The paper was old, soft at the edges, carrying the scent of cedar and dust from another lifetime. Evelyn Harrow had died 3 days ago at the age of 82, leaving behind almost nothing except a forgotten cabin deep in the mountains and one handwritten sentence that still echoed inside Caleb's mind like a voice refusing to fade. "I believe the house was always meant for you." He still did not understand why. He had only met Evelyn twice during the previous summer while repairing storm damage near Birch County. She had been small, silver-haired, wrapped in heavy wool sweaters even during warm evenings, and she spoke with the strange calm of someone who had already accepted every sorrow life could offer. The second time he visited her property, she had stood on the porch for nearly 10 minutes just watching Ranger move through the tall grass near the lake. "That dog hears things people forgot how to hear," she had whispered quietly. Caleb remembered laughing softly back then, but now, driving deeper into the storm toward the cabin she left him, those words no longer felt harmless. Snow crackled beneath the truck tires as the narrow road curved through dense pine forest where branches leaned overhead like dark cathedral beams. The deeper they traveled, the quieter the world became. No passing cars. No distant town lights. Only wind moving through frozen trees and the slow mechanical hum of the aging engine fighting the cold. Caleb had spent years searching for silence after leaving the Army Corps of Engineers, but silence in places like this always carried weight. It reminded him too much of long nights overseas when the world became still right before something changed forever. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears stiffened. A low rumble rolled quietly from his chest. Caleb looked over. "What is it, boy?" Ranger did not blink. His eyes remained locked on the darkness outside the windshield. Then, through the falling snow, the cabin finally appeared. It stood near the edge of Black Hollow Lake like something half-remembered from a dream. The structure was larger than Caleb expected, built from thick cedar logs blackened by age and weather, with a steep roof buried beneath snow and narrow windows glowing faintly silver beneath the moonlight hiding behind clouds. The lake beside it stretched silent and frozen, reflecting the storm like cracked glass beneath the night sky. For a moment, Caleb simply sat there staring at the place. It did not look abandoned. It looked waiting. Ranger let out another low growl. Caleb killed the engine, and the sudden silence that followed felt enormous. The wind softened. Snow drifted lazily through the trees. Somewhere far across the lake came the faint creak of shifting ice. Caleb stepped out into knee-deep snow, his boots sinking heavily as cold air wrapped around him like icy breath. Ranger jumped down beside him but did not wander far like usual. Instead, the shepherd stayed pressed close to Caleb's side, eyes fixed on the cabin door. The porch groaned softly beneath their weight as they climbed the steps. A rusted lantern swayed above them though there was almost no wind now. Caleb slid the old brass key into the lock. For a second, his hand paused. Something about the cabin felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not hostile. Just aware. Like the house itself knew someone had returned. He pushed the door open slowly. Warm cedar air drifted out into the cold night carrying traces of smoke, old books, dried pine needles, and something else beneath it all. Something older. Ranger froze instantly at the doorway. His muscles tightened beneath his thick fur. Then the dog turned slowly toward the far end of the dark hallway inside the cabin and released a deep growl Caleb had not heard since the war. The hallway beyond the doorway stretched deeper than Caleb expected, narrow and dim beneath a ceiling lined with dark cedar beams stained by decades of winters beside the lake. The air inside carried a strange warmth despite the freezing storm outside, as if the cabin had been holding its breath waiting for someone to return and wake it again. Ranger stood frozen beside Caleb, ears raised high, eyes locked toward the darkness near the back of the house where the hallway curved out of sight. The shepherd's growl remained low and steady, vibrating softly through the silence like distant thunder rolling beneath the earth. Caleb rested one gloved hand against the dog's neck. "Easy, boy." But Ranger did not relax. Caleb stepped inside slowly, old floorboards creaking beneath his boots while snow drifted through the open doorway behind them. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke, pine resin, old paper, and faint traces of lavender buried somewhere deep in the wood itself. Dust floated lazily through pale moonlight slipping between the curtains. Yet nothing inside looked abandoned. A cast iron kettle still rested atop the stone fireplace. Folded blankets sat neatly arranged on a couch near the hearth. Shelves of weathered books lined the walls beside framed black and white photographs faded by time. It looked less like a forgotten cabin and more like someone had stepped outside only moments ago. Caleb closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm. The sudden quiet pressed against his ears. Ranger immediately moved ahead, claws tapping sharply across the wooden floor as he inspected the room with disciplined precision learned years earlier during search operations overseas. He sniffed corners carefully, nose twitching, body tense beneath his thick silver-gray fur. Then he stopped beside the fireplace. Caleb noticed it immediately. The firewood stacked there looked fresh. Not recently cut, but not rotting either. Strange for a property untouched through an entire Montana winter. He crouched beside the stack and brushed his fingers across the bark. Dry. Clean. Almost recently handled. A chill moved slowly down his spine. Wind rattled softly against the windows. Somewhere deeper inside the cabin came a faint sound. Knock. Caleb lifted his head instantly. Ranger stiffened beside the fireplace. Another knock echoed faintly through the walls. Not loud. Not violent. Just slow and deliberate, like someone tapping carefully from far away. Caleb stood motionless, listening. The sound faded. Only the ticking of melting snow against the roof remained. He exhaled quietly. Probably old pipes, he muttered, though the cabin clearly had no running water anymore. Ranger turned toward the hallway again. This time the dog did not growl. He simply stared into the darkness with intense focus, ears twitching toward sounds Caleb still could not hear. Caleb grabbed the lantern hanging beside the fireplace and lit it with a nearby box of matches left neatly on the mantel. Warm amber light flickered across the cabin walls, breathing life into shadows that shifted softly across old photographs and faded furniture. One picture caught his attention immediately. Evelyn Harrow stood beside a tall man in military uniform near the edge of Black Hollow Lake sometime long ago. The man was broad-shouldered with calm eyes and dark hair swept back neatly by the wind. Beside them sat a younger German shepherd nearly identical to Ranger. Caleb stared at the photograph longer than he intended. The man's face carried the same quiet exhaustion Caleb recognized in veterans who had spent too many years carrying memories heavier than words. Beneath the frame, written carefully in faded ink, were three simple words. Still waiting for him. Ranger suddenly barked once. Sharp. Alert. Caleb turned instantly. The shepherd stood halfway down the hallway now, body rigid as stone. The lantern light barely reached him. Beyond the dog, darkness swallowed the far end of the cabin completely. Then Caleb noticed it. A faint line of warm yellow light beneath a closed door at the end of the hall. His pulse slowed strangely. He was certain the cabin had no electricity. The old power lines outside hung broken beneath snow-covered trees. Yet the thin ribbon of light remained there, unmoving, glowing softly beneath the door like the final ember of a dying fire. Ranger took one slow step backward without taking his eyes off it. Caleb walked carefully down the hallway, floorboards groaning softly beneath each step while cold air drifted from somewhere unseen. The closer he came, the warmer the air felt. Not natural warmth from a fireplace. This felt different. Almost alive. His hand slowly reached toward the brass doorknob. Then, from the other side of the door, came the unmistakable sound of a wooden chair moving gently across the floor. The sound came again, softer this time, the slow scrape of wood across wood somewhere beyond the closed door. Caleb stood motionless at the end of the hallway with one hand resting on the cold brass knob while the lantern flickered gently in his other hand, casting nervous shadows across the cedar walls. Ranger remained several feet behind him, body low, ears pinned back in a way Caleb had only seen during dangerous search operations overseas when the dog sensed unstable ground or hidden movement beneath collapsed structures. The air around the door felt strangely warm compared to the rest of the cabin, carrying the faint scent of cedar smoke and something older beneath it, something like faded cologne trapped inside wood for decades. Caleb swallowed slowly and turned the knob. The hinges creaked softly as the door drifted inward. The room beyond was empty. At first glance, it looked untouched by time. Moonlight spilled through lace curtains near the far wall, illuminating a small bedroom preserved so carefully it almost hurt to look at. A neatly made bed sat beneath a handmade quilt stitched from faded blue and gray fabric squares. An oil lamp rested beside a stack of books near the window. Dust floated lazily through silver light like tiny drifting memories. Yet something about the room felt wrong. The rocking chair near the fireplace still moved gently back and forth. Caleb stared at it in silence. The chair slowed gradually until it became still. Ranger refused to enter. The shepherd stood frozen in the doorway, eyes fixed on the floorboards near the bed. Caleb stepped carefully inside, lantern raised slightly. The warmth inside the room felt unnatural now, almost breathing against his skin. He moved toward the fireplace and noticed ashes resting inside the stone pit below. Fresh ashes. Not warm, but recent enough that they had not yet settled completely gray. Caleb crouched beside them, confusion tightening across his face. Evelyn had been dead nearly a week. No one should have been here. Wind sighed softly outside the cabin windows while ice shifted somewhere across the lake like distant thunder muffled beneath snow. Then came another sound. Tap. 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 Caleb turned slowly toward the far wall. Ranger let out a low warning growl from the doorway. The tapping came again, faint but deliberate, from inside the wall itself. Caleb moved closer carefully. Old military instincts sharpened instantly inside him, the same instincts that once taught him how to hear hidden movement beneath silence. He pressed one hand against the cedar boards. Cold. Solid. But beneath the wood came another sound. 3 slow knocks. Then silence. Caleb stepped back immediately. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. The dog suddenly rushed into the room for the first time, claws sliding across the floor as he moved directly toward the old wardrobe standing beside the bed. The shepherd sniffed aggressively near the bottom corner before scratching hard against the floorboards beneath it. Caleb dragged the wardrobe aside slowly. Beneath it sat a narrow metal latch built directly into the floor. His heartbeat slowed. The hidden compartment looked old, nearly invisible beneath layers of worn cedar planks. Caleb knelt carefully and pulled the latch upward. A section of the floor lifted with a long groan of old hinges, releasing a breath of cold air from beneath the cabin that smelled of earth, stone, and ancient wood sealed away from daylight for years. Ranger backed away instantly, tail low, eyes fixed on the darkness below. Caleb lowered the lantern toward the opening. A narrow staircase disappeared underground beneath the cabin. Stone walls lined the passage downward, disappearing into shadows too deep for the lantern light to reach completely. The tapping sound stopped. Silence returned once more, heavy and listening. Caleb stared down into the hidden stairwell while snow hissed softly against the cabin roof overhead. Then he noticed something resting halfway down the stairs. A single leather boot covered in dust. His chest tightened immediately. The boot looked military. Old, weathered, forgotten. Caleb descended slowly, lantern trembling faintly in his grip as Ranger reluctantly followed behind him. The narrow staircase creaked beneath their combined weight until they reached a small underground room carved directly beneath the cabin foundation. The space smelled of cold stone and rusted metal. Shelves lined the walls holding canned food, lantern oil, old blankets, and stacks of yellowed newspapers tied neatly with twine. It looked less like a storage cellar and more like someone had prepared to survive underground for a very long time. Caleb turned slowly, the lantern glow sweeping across the hidden room. Then the light stopped on something hanging from a nail near the far wall. An old army field jacket covered in dust. Sewn carefully above the breast pocket was a faded name tape. Thomas Harrow. Ranger suddenly whimpered softly beside him. Then, from somewhere deeper behind the stone wall ahead, came the unmistakable sound of slow breathing. The sound behind the stone wall did not belong underground. It was too steady, too human, carrying the slow rhythm of breath filling unseen lungs somewhere beneath the mountain itself. Caleb stood frozen in the lantern glow while cold air drifted through the hidden cellar like invisible water moving through cracks in stone. Ranger pressed close against his leg now, not growling anymore but trembling slightly beneath his thick fur, his amber eyes fixed on the dark wall ahead as though he recognized something Caleb could not yet understand. The breathing continued for several long seconds. Slow inhale. Slow exhale. Then silence returned all at once, so suddenly it made the underground room feel even colder. Caleb swallowed hard and stepped carefully toward the far wall. The old field jacket hanging nearby swayed faintly although there was no wind below the cabin. Dust floated through the lantern light in slow spirals while shadows shifted gently across shelves packed with forgotten supplies. Whoever built this place had prepared it carefully. Military precision lived in every detail. Food organized by date. Blankets folded tightly. Lantern fuel stacked beside sealed crates marked with faded army lettering nearly erased by time. Caleb knelt beside one of the crates and brushed away years of dust with his sleeve. The markings underneath became visible slowly. Property of United States Army Corps of Engineers. His chest tightened. He had seen identical crates years earlier during overseas reconstruction operations after bridge collapses and winter floods. The realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Thomas Harrow had not simply been a veteran hiding in the woods. He had been an engineer, just like Caleb. Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the stone wall again. His ears twitched. Then came 3 faint knocks from somewhere beyond the rock. Tap. 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 Caleb moved closer immediately, lantern raised. The wall itself looked uneven compared to the rest of the cellar foundation. One section carried darker stone, smoother around the edges as if someone had sealed an opening long ago. Caleb ran his fingers across the surface and felt something beneath the dust. Metal. He lowered the lantern carefully and uncovered a rusted iron handle hidden inside the stonework. Ranger let out a soft whine. Caleb hesitated for only a second before pulling hard. At first nothing happened. Then deep inside the wall came the groan of old gears shifting against frozen hinges. Stone scraped slowly against stone as a narrow section of the wall moved inward several inches, releasing a gust of air so cold it extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the room. Caleb's pulse surged. Ranger barked sharply beside him. For a moment neither moved. Then moonlight filtered faintly down the cellar stairs behind them, just enough for Caleb to relight the lantern with shaking hands. The hidden passage beyond the wall was narrow and lined with rough stone disappearing into darkness beneath the cabin. The air inside smelled ancient, carrying traces of earth, rust, and lake water. Caleb stared into the tunnel while every instinct inside him whispered caution. Yet beneath the fear lived something else. Recognition. The same strange pull he had felt ever since receiving Evelyn's letter. As though every step inside this cabin had already been waiting for him long before he arrived. Ranger refused to enter the passage at first. The shepherd planted his paws firmly against the cellar floor, body tense, staring deep into the darkness ahead. Caleb crouched beside him gently. "You do not have to like it," he whispered softly. "Just stay with me." Ranger finally moved forward. Together they entered the hidden tunnel beneath the cabin while silence closed around them like water. The narrow passage sloped downward beneath the mountain for nearly 30 feet before opening into another chamber carved directly into the rock beside the frozen lake. Caleb stopped instantly. The room ahead was not a bunker. It was a workshop. Old drafting tables stood beneath hanging lanterns coated in dust. Blueprints covered the walls beside maps of Black Hollow Lake marked with faded red circles and handwritten notes. Tools rested neatly arranged across shelves untouched for years. In the center of the room stood a large radio console connected to strange monitoring equipment Caleb barely recognized. The machine itself looked decades old, built from military surplus parts and carefully modified by hand. Ranger moved slowly around the chamber, nose twitching, until he stopped beside a wooden chair facing the radio equipment. The chair rocked gently on its own. Caleb felt cold move through his chest. There was no wind inside the chamber. Yet the chair continued moving softly back and forth like someone had stood up only moments earlier. Then the radio crackled. Static burst sharply through the silence, making Ranger flinch backward. Caleb stepped toward it carefully while lights flickered weakly across the ancient console. Through the static came a voice so faint it almost disappeared beneath the noise. "Evelyn," the voice broke apart. Then returned again, weaker this time. "He finally came home." Ranger slowly lowered himself onto the cold stone floor beside Caleb, ears flat, eyes fixed not on the radio but on the dark tunnel behind them where soft footsteps had just begun echoing slowly toward the chamber. The footsteps beyond the tunnel moved slowly, unevenly, like someone carrying years heavier than their own body. Caleb stood frozen beside the old radio console while static hissed softly through the chamber, crackling beneath the faint hum of ancient equipment somehow still alive after decades underground. Ranger rose immediately from the stone floor, his broad shoulders stiffening as low warning sounds rolled quietly from deep inside his chest. Yet there was no aggression in the dog now. No fear either. Only tension mixed with something stranger. Recognition. The footsteps stopped just beyond the reach of lantern light inside the tunnel. Silence swallowed the chamber once more. Caleb could hear only the distant creaking of ice above the lake and the faint electrical hum vibrating through the old radio machinery. Then came the smell. Smoke. Not fresh smoke from firewood, but the faded scent of old campfires soaked into wool and leather after years outdoors. Caleb turned slowly toward the tunnel entrance. Shadows shifted faintly against the stone walls. For one impossible second, he thought he saw the outline of someone standing there. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Motionless. Then the lantern flame flickered violently and the figure disappeared into darkness again. Ranger took one careful step forward. His ears lowered. His tail remained still behind him. Caleb swallowed slowly and forced himself to breathe evenly. "Who is there?" His voice echoed softly through the chamber before fading into silence. No answer came. Only the slow dripping of water somewhere deeper beneath the mountain. The radio crackled again. A burst of static filled the room before the faint voice returned through the speakers, weak and fractured by age. "Black Hollow Monitoring Station, if anyone hears this, the lake is not stable anymore." Caleb stepped toward the console immediately. His pulse quickened as he adjusted one of the dusty dials. The voice became slightly clearer. Older. Exhausted. If Evelyn is listening, do not let anyone open the lower gate. Static swallowed the message. Ranger suddenly barked once toward the far side of the chamber. Caleb lifted the lantern quickly. Another tunnel branched away behind the radio equipment, hidden partially beneath hanging tarps and rusted shelving. Cold air drifted steadily from the darkness beyond. Caleb moved carefully toward it while Ranger remained pressed close beside him. The second tunnel felt different immediately. Narrower. Colder. Moisture coated the stone walls while faint vibrations pulsed beneath the floor every few seconds like a distant heartbeat moving beneath the mountain itself. Caleb stopped walking. He knew that rhythm. Combat engineers learned to feel structural stress through their boots long before buildings collapsed. The vibration beneath the tunnel felt controlled. Mechanical. Deliberate. Ranger lowered his nose to the ground and followed the tunnel deeper until it opened suddenly into another hidden chamber unlike anything Caleb expected. The room stretched wide beneath the frozen lake above, supported by thick steel beams disappearing into shadows overhead. Massive pipes lined the walls beside old generators coated in rust and mineral stains. At the center of the chamber stood an enormous steel door built directly into the rock face, nearly 12 feet high, covered in faded warning symbols Caleb barely recognized. Above the door, painted carefully in peeling white letters, were two words. Flood control. Caleb stared in disbelief. The entire hidden structure beneath the cabin was not simply a bunker. It was part of something larger buried beneath Black Hollow Lake itself. Ranger moved toward the steel door slowly. His claws clicked softly against the concrete floor while the deep vibrations beneath the chamber grew slightly stronger. Then the dog stopped abruptly beside a metal desk overturned near the wall. He sniffed urgently beneath it before scratching twice against the concrete. Caleb knelt beside the desk and pulled free a weathered leather notebook buried underneath decades of dust. The cover carried faded initials burned carefully into the leather. Caleb opened it slowly. Most pages were filled with engineering sketches, measurements, and maintenance schedules written in careful military handwriting. But near the middle of the notebook, one sentence had been underlined repeatedly in dark ink. The mountain is shifting faster every winter. Caleb turned another page. His breath caught immediately. A detailed map of Black Hollow Lake spread across the paper with tunnels marked beneath the surrounding mountainside. One section carried a red circle directly beneath Evelyn's cabin. Beside it, Thomas Harrow had written only 4 chilling words. Access point must remain hidden. Ranger suddenly backed away from the steel door, ears pinned flat. A deep metallic groan echoed somewhere beyond the wall. The massive door vibrated slightly. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams overhead. Then, from the other side of the steel barrier, came the unmistakable sound of someone knocking slowly from within. The knocking beyond the steel door came again, slow and hollow, carrying through the underground chamber like sound traveling beneath deep water. Caleb stood motionless with Thomas Harrow's notebook still open in his hands while dust drifted from the ceiling beams overhead. Ranger backed farther away from the massive barrier, ears flattened tightly against his head now, but the shepherd did not bark. He simply watched the door with the heavy focus of an animal listening to something larger than fear itself. The vibrations beneath the concrete floor continued pulsing steadily every few seconds. Caleb forced himself to breathe slowly. Nothing about the hidden structure beneath Black Hollow Lake made sense anymore. Flood control systems buried beneath a remote mountain cabin. Secret tunnels. Military engineering equipment. A missing veteran who had apparently spent years hiding underground. Yet somehow the strangest part of all was the feeling growing inside Caleb's chest that none of this was accidental. The notebook pages trembled slightly in his hands as another pulse rolled through the chamber floor. He lowered the lantern toward the final pages carefully. Most entries became rushed near the end, the handwriting uneven as though Thomas had written them during exhaustion or fear. Maintenance failures. Structural shifts. Water pressure increasing beneath the northern ridge. Then Caleb found a final completed entry written in darker ink than the others. If the lower gate opens fully, Black Hollow Lake will swallow the valley within 6 hours. Caleb stared at the sentence while cold moved slowly through his body. The entire lake above them was being held back by whatever ancient system remained hidden behind the steel door. Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the tunnel behind them. Soft footsteps echoed faintly once more from somewhere deeper inside the underground complex. Slow. Measured. Human. Caleb turned immediately, lantern raised. Shadows moved gently across the tunnel walls but nothing appeared. The footsteps stopped again. Silence followed. Then, from somewhere above the lake far overhead, came the muffled groan of shifting ice. Caleb exhaled quietly and looked back toward the steel barrier. "What were you protecting down here, Thomas?" The answer came unexpectedly. The old radio system in the previous chamber crackled loudly through hidden speakers overhead, startling both Caleb and Ranger. Static hissed through the underground corridors before a faint voice emerged once more. "Older now. Weaker. The gate cannot hold forever." Caleb moved quickly back through the tunnel toward the radio chamber with Ranger close beside him. The voice continued breaking through bursts of static. "If someone finds this station, listen carefully." Caleb reached the console and adjusted the dials again. Lights flickered weakly across the dusty equipment. The voice sharpened slightly. "The mountain shifted during the winter of 1971. We sealed the lower chamber before the pressure cracked the lake bed." Static interrupted the message briefly before the voice returned softer than before. "I stayed because someone had to keep the system alive." Caleb felt his pulse slow. Thomas Harrow had not vanished. He had volunteered to remain hidden beneath the lake protecting the valley above for decades. Ranger moved quietly through the chamber while the old transmission continued. "Evelyn wanted me to leave. I could not." The voice paused. Faint breathing crackled through the speaker. "If you are hearing this now, then she is gone." Caleb swallowed hard. The loneliness inside those words felt enormous. Not fear. Not regret. Just the exhaustion of a man who had sacrificed his entire life in silence where nobody would ever know his name. The transmission faded into static again before returning one final time. "The cabin chooses carefully. If it brought you here, trust the dog." Then the speakers went silent completely. Ranger stood motionless beside the radio console, staring toward the ceiling as if listening for something still hidden beneath the static. Caleb rested one hand against the old equipment slowly. "The cabin chooses carefully." The sentence unsettled him more than anything else he had discovered underground. Wind howled faintly somewhere above the lake now, filtering through hidden ventilation shafts with a sound almost like distant voices whispering through pine trees. Then the lights inside the chamber flickered violently. The floor trembled beneath their feet. Ranger barked sharply and rushed toward the tunnel leading back to the steel gate chamber. Caleb followed instantly. When they reached the room again, his breath caught. Water dripped steadily from the massive steel door now, spilling through seams that had remained dry moments earlier. Thin cracks spread across the concrete floor beneath it while the deep metallic groaning behind the barrier grew louder with each passing second. Something immense shifted somewhere beyond the gate. Caleb stepped backward slowly. Then he noticed the wheel mechanism mounted beside the steel door. Fresh fingerprints covered the dust coating the metal. Someone had touched it recently. Very recently. Ranger stared toward the darkness behind them again. The footsteps had returned. This time they were closer. And somewhere beyond the tunnel entrance, hidden in the shadows beneath Black Hollow Lake, a man's voice whispered softly through the dark. "You should not have opened the wall." The whisper disappeared into the darkness so softly Caleb almost convinced himself he imagined it. But Ranger had heard it too. The German shepherd stood rigid beside the tunnel entrance, every muscle locked tight beneath his silver-gray coat while his amber eyes stared unblinking into the shadows beyond the lantern light. Water continued dripping steadily from the steel gate behind them, each drop echoing sharply through the underground chamber like a clock counting down toward something neither of them yet understood. Caleb forced his breathing steady and raised the lantern higher. "Who is there?" His voice carried through the tunnel walls before fading into silence. No answer came. Only the low mechanical groaning beneath the floor and the distant shifting of ice far above the lake. Then another vibration rolled through the chamber, stronger this time. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams. The enormous steel barrier trembled faintly as though immense pressure pushed against it from the other side. Caleb looked toward the wheel mechanism mounted beside the gate. Fresh fingerprints still marked the dust coating the metal. Someone had been here recently. Not decades ago. Not years ago. Recently enough that the oils from human skin remained visible beneath the lantern glow. Ranger suddenly moved forward into the darkness without warning. Caleb followed immediately. The tunnel beyond the chamber twisted deeper beneath the mountain, narrower now and colder with every step. Moisture coated the stone walls while old pipes rattled softly overhead carrying water through unseen systems still somehow functioning after all these years. Caleb noticed something else too. The tunnel floor showed signs of recent movement. Faint boot prints disturbed the thick dust covering the concrete. Fresh enough that the edges had not fully settled. Ranger tracked the scent carefully, nose low, body moving with focused precision learned from years of military search training. The farther they traveled, the warmer the air became. Not natural warmth from underground machinery. This carried the dry heat of old generators still running somewhere deeper inside the mountain. Caleb felt unease tightening slowly inside his chest. Someone was maintaining the hidden system beneath Black Hollow Lake. Someone alive. The tunnel opened suddenly into a narrow observation room overlooking an enormous underground cavern carved beneath the frozen lake above. Caleb stopped instantly at the sight before him. Massive support columns disappeared into darkness overhead while old catwalks stretched across the cavern like rusted spiderwebs suspended above black water far below. Ancient turbines turned slowly beneath the surface, groaning softly with every rotation. Weak emergency lights flickered across the walls, bathing the entire cavern in dim amber light that felt more dreamlike than real. Ranger moved cautiously onto the nearest catwalk, claws clicking softly against rusted steel grates. Caleb followed slowly while cold mist drifted upward from the dark water beneath them. The entire hidden facility felt impossibly old yet somehow alive, breathing quietly beneath the mountain like a forgotten machine refusing to die. Then Caleb saw it. At the far end of the cavern, nearly 70 yards away across the catwalk system, stood a single lantern glowing warmly beside a small maintenance platform. Someone was there. A figure moved slowly through the light before disappearing behind old machinery. Ranger barked sharply. The sound echoed across the cavern instantly. Silence followed. Then the lantern at the far platform went dark. Caleb's pulse quickened. "Wait." His voice carried through the chamber. No response came. Only the slow creaking of steel and the endless groan of water moving beneath the lake. Caleb moved quickly across the catwalk while Ranger stayed close beside him. The metal structure trembled faintly beneath their weight. Halfway across, another deep vibration rolled through the cavern. The turbines below shuddered violently. Somewhere far behind them came the metallic scream of stressed steel bending beneath pressure. Caleb stopped immediately. His engineering instincts sharpened. The entire structure beneath the lake was weakening. Ranger suddenly froze beside the railing. The shepherd stared downward into the black water below. Caleb followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing except darkness reflecting the weak emergency lights overhead. Then something moved beneath the surface. A shape. Large. Human. It drifted slowly beneath the water directly below the catwalk before disappearing into darkness again. Caleb felt cold spread through his chest. Ranger backed away from the railing with a low uneasy growl. Then, from somewhere deep inside the cavern ahead, came the sound of a piano playing softly. Just a few quiet notes echoing gently through the underground darkness. Caleb stared ahead in disbelief. The melody sounded old. Slow. Familiar somehow. He continued forward carefully until they reached the maintenance platform at the far side of the cavern. The lantern still sat there glowing warmly beside a small wooden table. Steam rose faintly from a metal coffee cup resting beside it. Someone had been here moments ago. Caleb lifted the cup slowly. Still warm. Ranger moved toward a nearby doorway leading deeper into the mountain. The dog stopped there, ears raised high. Then he whimpered softly for the first time since entering the cabin. Caleb stepped beside him and looked through the doorway. A narrow room stretched beyond it, lit by candlelight. On the far wall hung dozens of photographs. Every single one showed Caleb himself. Caleb stood motionless in the doorway while candlelight flickered softly across the walls of the hidden room beneath the mountain. Photographs covered nearly every inch of cedar paneling from floor to ceiling. Some were recent. Some looked years old. Yet every single one showed him. Caleb repairing storm fences outside Birch County. Caleb sitting beside campfires during winters alone on the road. Caleb standing beside Ranger near gas stations, forests, highways, and lonely mountain towns stretching across half the country. Hundreds of moments from his life had been captured silently without his knowledge. Ranger stepped into the room slowly now, his earlier fear fading into something calmer, almost sorrowful. The shepherd moved carefully between stacks of books and old equipment before stopping beside a wooden desk near the far wall. Caleb barely noticed. His attention remained trapped by the photographs. One image near the center showed him from nearly 15 years earlier standing in military uniform beside a damaged bridge overseas. Younger then. Harder. Still carrying the sharp edges war had not yet worn smooth. Caleb stepped closer slowly. Beneath the photograph, written carefully in faded ink, were 4 simple words. He survived the collapse. His chest tightened instantly. Very few people knew about the bridge incident. Half the engineering unit had been reassigned afterward. The official reports blamed structural instability. But Caleb remembered the truth. The bridge had failed because someone ignored critical safety warnings. 32 people nearly died that night. Ranger nudged softly against Caleb's leg. Caleb turned toward the desk beside the dog. An old tape recorder rested there beside dozens of cassette tapes labeled carefully by date. Beside them sat a single-framed photograph of Evelyn Harrow standing beside Thomas near Black Hollow Lake during summer many decades earlier. They looked happy. Peaceful. The kind of peace that only exists before people understand how much life can take away. Caleb noticed something else in the photograph too. A little boy stood beside them near the lakeshore, maybe 6 years old, dark-haired and smiling beneath a fishing cap too large for his head. Caleb frowned softly. He had never seen any mention of a child. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the far corner of the room. Someone sat there in the shadows. Caleb froze instantly. An old man slowly leaned forward into the candlelight. His face looked carved from years underground, pale and deeply lined, with silver hair falling loose around tired blue eyes that still carried surprising clarity beneath the exhaustion. A heavy wool blanket rested around his shoulders while one hand gripped the arm of an old wooden chair beside a small iron stove glowing faintly red. Caleb stared in silence. The old man studied him quietly for several seconds before speaking. "You look more like your father every winter." Caleb's pulse slowed sharply. "Who are you?" The old man smiled faintly, though sadness lived behind it. "Thomas Harrow." Silence filled the hidden room. The name felt unreal spoken aloud after decades buried beneath rumors and disappearances. Caleb struggled to breathe evenly. You are supposed to be dead. Thomas lowered his eyes toward the glowing stove. Some men disappear because they want to escape. Others disappear because leaving would destroy everything above them. Ranger moved toward Thomas slowly now. The old shepherd's fear had vanished completely. He sat quietly beside the chair while Thomas rested one weathered hand gently against the dog's neck. "Good boy," he whispered softly. "You hear the mountain too?" Caleb stared at the two of them while questions crashed through his mind faster than he could speak them. "You have been down here all these years?" Thomas nodded once. 42 winters. The answer settled heavily into the room. Caleb looked around at the photographs, the tapes, the hidden chambers beneath the mountain. "Why?" Thomas leaned back slowly, eyes drifting toward the ceiling where faint vibrations still echoed through the hidden structure. "Because the lake is breaking." The old man pointed weakly toward the tunnels beyond the room. This place was never only flood control. During the Cold War, they built emergency containment systems beneath the mountain after seismic activity started cracking the lake bed. Caleb listened silently while distant mechanical groans echoed faintly through the underground chambers. Thomas continued quietly. The engineers discovered natural pressure chambers beneath Black Hollow Lake. If the lower fault line collapses completely, the entire valley above floods within hours. Caleb felt cold move through his chest again. "And they left you here alone to maintain it?" Thomas smiled sadly. "No. They abandoned the project after the government cut funding in 1971. But by then the mountain had already shifted too far." Candlelight flickered softly across the old man's face while snow hissed faintly through distant ventilation shafts overhead. Someone had to stay behind and keep the lower gates stable. Caleb looked toward the family photograph. On the desk again. "What about Evelyn?" Thomas's expression softened instantly. "She stayed as long as she could." His voice nearly broke beneath the weight of memory. "But I would not let her spend her life underground beside a dying machine." Silence lingered gently between them. Then Caleb asked the question tightening slowly inside his chest since entering the hidden room. "Why me?" Thomas looked directly at him now. "Because your father was the last man who tried to help me leave this place alive." Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply. The floor beneath them trembled harder than before. Somewhere deep beyond the tunnels came the terrible sound of steel snapping beneath pressure. The sound of steel snapping echoed through the hidden chambers beneath Black Hollow Lake like thunder trapped inside the mountain. Dust burst from the ceiling overhead while the floor beneath Caleb's boots shuddered violently for several terrifying seconds before settling again into a low constant vibration. Ranger barked sharply and rushed toward the tunnel entrance, claws scraping across the wooden floorboards as the shepherd searched for danger beyond the candlelit room. Thomas Harrow remained seated beside the iron stove, but Caleb noticed the old man's face tighten with quiet understanding rather than fear. He had heard sounds like this before. Many times before. "The northern braces are failing faster now," Thomas whispered softly, staring toward the stone walls around them as though listening to the mountain breathe. "The ice above the lake shifts heavier every winter." Caleb stepped closer immediately. "Then we need to shut the system down and get out of here." Thomas gave a faint tired smile. "There is no shutting it down anymore." Candlelight trembled across the photographs covering the walls while cold air drifted through the hidden room carrying the scent of frozen water and old machinery. Ranger returned to Caleb's side but remained tense, ears raised high toward distant sounds echoing through the tunnels beyond. Caleb looked back toward Thomas. "You said my father tried to help you leave." Thomas lowered his eyes toward the glowing stove for a long moment before speaking again. "Your father was the only engineer who believed the mountain was alive." Caleb frowned slightly. "Alive?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Not alive the way people are alive. But the lake remembers pressure. Stone remembers movement. Everything beneath this valley shifts together like breathing." He glanced toward the ceiling again as another faint tremor passed through the structure overhead. Most men only hear noise. Your father heard patterns. Caleb leaned against the desk quietly while emotions he could not fully name moved slowly through him. He had spent most of his life barely speaking about his father after the accident that killed him when Caleb was 19. The man had always carried silence like a second skin, restless and distant even before his death. Now pieces of that silence were beginning to make sense. Thomas reached slowly toward one of the cassette tapes stacked beside the recorder and handed it carefully to Caleb. He left this for you before the storm took him. Caleb stared down at the faded tape label. His father's handwriting covered the front in dark blue ink. For Caleb. Only when the mountain calls you home. His chest tightened instantly. Why did nobody ever give this to me? Thomas smiled sadly. Because Evelyn promised him she would wait until the cabin chose you. Caleb almost laughed at the absurdity of the sentence, but the sound died before reaching his throat. Too many impossible things had already happened beneath Black Hollow Lake for disbelief to survive much longer. Ranger suddenly moved toward the far wall again where the family photograph rested beside the candlelight. This time Caleb noticed something he had missed before. The little boy standing beside Thomas and Evelyn in the old picture wore a silver chain around his neck. A chain identical to the one Caleb still carried beneath his shirt every day. Caleb stepped closer slowly. His hand instinctively touched the chain resting against his chest. Who is that child? Thomas looked toward the photograph quietly. For the first time since Caleb met him, the old man's calm expression cracked beneath visible grief. Our son. Silence filled the room softly. The stove crackled beside them while distant machinery groaned somewhere deeper beneath the lake. Caleb swallowed carefully. What happened to him? Thomas closed his eyes briefly. The mountain took him during the first collapse in 1971. Ranger lowered himself quietly beside the old man's chair as though sensing sorrow too deep for words. Thomas rested one trembling hand against the shepherd's back. After that, Evelyn could no longer bear hearing the lake. Candlelight flickered across the old photographs while snow hissed faintly through distant ventilation shafts somewhere overhead. Caleb looked again at the child in the picture. Something about the boy's face felt strangely familiar now. Not resemblance. Recognition. Then another violent tremor rolled through the mountain. The walls shook harder than before. Candles flickered wildly. Somewhere far beyond the tunnels came the deafening roar of rushing water. Thomas stood immediately despite his age, eyes sharp with sudden urgency. The lower chamber breached. Caleb grabbed the lantern quickly. What does that mean? Thomas looked directly at him now. It means the lake has started entering the fault tunnels. Ranger barked sharply toward the cavern beyond the room. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling now, faster with every passing second. Thomas moved toward an old steel cabinet beside the stove and pulled out a weathered key attached to a military tag covered in faded numbers. He placed it firmly into Caleb's hand. There is one final control chamber beneath the turbines. Caleb stared at the key. You want me to stabilize the gates? Thomas shook his head slowly. No, his tired blue eyes lifted toward the trembling mountain around them. I want you to open them before the lake destroys the entire valley above. The mountain groaned around them like something ancient waking beneath the frozen lake. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling now, splashing against the stone floor in cold uneven rhythms while deep mechanical vibrations rolled through the hidden chambers beneath Black Hollow Lake. Caleb stared at the rusted military key resting in his palm, its worn edges cold against his skin. Thomas Harrow stood before him beneath flickering candlelight, exhausted blue eyes filled not with panic but with the calm certainty of a man who had carried the same burden for far too many years. Ranger paced restlessly near the doorway, claws scraping softly across the floorboards while distant alarms suddenly echoed through the underground structure for the first time since Caleb entered the mountain. Low metallic sirens pulsed faintly through hidden corridors, ancient warning systems dragged awake after decades of silence. If I open the gates, Caleb said quietly, the lake floods the tunnels. Thomas nodded once. It releases the pressure before the fault line collapses beneath the valley. Another violent tremor shook the room. Candles flickered wildly. One of the photographs fell from the wall, the glass shattering softly across the floor beside Ranger's paws. Caleb looked down at the picture. It showed his father standing beside Thomas near the lakeshore many years earlier, both men younger then, smiling faintly while storm clouds gathered behind them over Black Hollow Lake. On the back of the broken frame, hidden beneath the photograph, Caleb noticed handwriting faded nearly beyond recognition. Some men are chosen to hold the line so others never know there was danger. Caleb swallowed hard. His father had known everything. Maybe even planned for this night long before his death. Thomas moved slowly toward the doorway, one hand gripping the wall for balance as the mountain trembled again around them. The lower control chamber sits beneath the turbine basin. The release system still works manually if the main generators have not failed completely. Caleb stepped beside him immediately. Then we both go. Thomas smiled sadly without looking at him. No, Ranger lifted his head sharply as though understanding the weight hidden beneath the old man's voice. I stayed here for 42 years because someone had to keep the mountain asleep. Thomas glanced toward the dark tunnel stretching beneath the lake. But now it is your turn to let it wake. Caleb felt anger rise suddenly through the exhaustion and confusion gripping his chest. You are talking like you are not coming back. Thomas remained silent for several seconds. Then he looked toward the ceiling where water now streamed steadily through widening cracks in the stone. This place does not release people easily. Before Caleb could answer, the lights throughout the hidden chambers failed completely. Darkness swallowed the room instantly except for the weak glow of candlelight and the lantern trembling faintly in Caleb's hand. Somewhere deep beyond the tunnels came the terrible sound of rushing water smashing against steel barriers. Ranger barked sharply and moved toward the doorway. Thomas grabbed a heavy wool coat hanging beside the stove and placed it carefully around his shoulders before turning back toward Caleb one final time. There is something else your father never told you. Caleb stared at him quietly while cold air rushed through the underground corridors around them. Thomas's tired expression softened beneath the flickering shadows. The bridge collapse overseas was not an accident. Caleb felt his pulse stop. Thomas continued softly. Your father discovered corruption inside the engineering contracts connected to this facility decades earlier. When he tried exposing it, people disappeared. Records vanished. Entire sections of the project were erased. Ranger stood silently between them now, ears lowered beneath the distant roar of failing machinery somewhere below the lake. Thomas looked toward the dog with quiet understanding. That is why Evelyn watched over you all these years. She promised your father she would make certain the cabin found you before the mountain failed completely. Another tremor rolled violently through the chambers. The floor cracked near the far wall. Water burst upward through the fracture like icy breath escaping from beneath the earth. Caleb grabbed Thomas's arm immediately. We are wasting time. Thomas nodded slowly. Together they moved quickly through the hidden tunnels while emergency sirens echoed through the mountain in low mournful waves. Ranger led ahead through the darkness without hesitation now, guiding them deeper beneath the lake toward the lower control chamber hidden beneath the turbines. The farther they descended, the louder the sound of rushing water became. Steam drifted through the corridors. Rusted pipes groaned overhead. Ancient emergency lights flickered weakly red along the walls like fading heartbeats inside the mountain itself. Finally the tunnel opened into a vast circular chamber beneath the turbine basin. Massive gears turned slowly above black water swirling violently beneath steel catwalks suspended nearly 50 feet overhead. At the center of the chamber stood a single control pedestal connected to enormous hydraulic systems disappearing into the rock walls around them. One final gate release lever remained locked beneath thick chains and rusted steel bolts. Caleb stepped toward it carefully while Ranger suddenly froze near the edge of the catwalk. The shepherd growled low beneath his breath. Caleb turned instantly. Someone stood across the chamber in the shadows beyond the red emergency lights. A tall figure wearing an old military coat. Motionless. Watching them silently from the darkness beside the rising water. The figure across the chamber did not move at first. Red emergency lights pulsed weakly through the rising mist while black water churned violently beneath the steel catwalk suspended inside the enormous underground basin. Caleb stood frozen beside the release mechanism with the rusted military key clenched tightly in his hand while Ranger growled low near the edge of the platform, his amber eyes fixed on the motionless silhouette beyond the shadows. Water thundered somewhere deep inside the mountain now, louder than before, pressing against ancient steel gates never meant to survive this many winters. Thomas Harrow stepped slowly beside Caleb, breathing heavier with every passing second. The old man stared toward the distant figure with an expression Caleb could not fully understand. Not fear. Recognition. Sadness. Then the figure finally stepped forward into the flickering emergency light. Caleb's breath caught instantly. The man looked almost identical to Thomas. Younger perhaps by 20 years, though pale and hollow-eyed beneath dripping gray hair. He wore an old military engineer coat soaked dark with water, and around his neck hung a silver chain matching the one Caleb carried beneath his shirt. Ranger stopped growling immediately. Instead the shepherd lowered his ears and whimpered softly, as though sensing grief too old for anger. The man across the chamber smiled faintly. You finally brought him here. His voice echoed strangely through the cavern, softer than it should have been beneath the roar of machinery and water. Caleb looked toward Thomas in confusion. The old man lowered his eyes slowly. Elias. The name hung heavily inside the underground chamber. Caleb stared back toward the younger man while pieces of the story shifted painfully into place. The little boy in the photograph. The child Thomas said the mountain had taken during the collapse in 1971. Yet somehow he stood here now beneath Black Hollow Lake unchanged by time itself. Elias stepped closer along the catwalk, boots making no sound against the rusted steel grating. The gates cannot hold much longer, he said quietly. The lake is already entering the lower fault tunnels. Caleb forced himself to speak through the confusion tightening his chest. You are supposed to be dead. Elias smiled sadly beneath the pulsing red lights. Some parts of me are. Another violent tremor shook the chamber. The catwalk groaned beneath their feet while icy water burst through cracked pipes overhead. Ranger barked sharply toward the turbine basin below where the black water had risen several feet higher since they entered the chamber. Thomas gripped the railing beside him as exhaustion overtook his face. Elias stayed after the collapse, he whispered softly. Or perhaps the mountain never truly let him leave. Caleb looked between them in disbelief. None of it should have been possible. Yet beneath the mountain, surrounded by impossible machinery and hidden chambers buried beneath decades of silence, disbelief no longer carried much meaning. Elias moved closer now until the flickering emergency lights revealed his face clearly. He looked no older than 30 despite supposedly vanishing over 40 years earlier. But his eyes carried unbearable loneliness inside them, the kind only found in people who had spent too long listening to silence. The mountain changes people who stay beneath it, Elias said softly, as though hearing Caleb's thoughts before they formed. Time moves differently here. Ranger slowly approached him now without fear. Elias knelt carefully beside the shepherd and rested one hand gently against the dog's neck. You hear it too, do not you? The shepherd leaned softly into the touch while distant mechanical alarms echoed through the cavern around them. Caleb stepped toward the chained release lever near the center platform. Tell me what happens if I open the gates. Elias rose slowly beside Ranger. The pressure beneath the fault tunnels releases into the northern spillways. He pointed toward the roaring black water below the turbines. The valley survives. Caleb tightened his grip on the rusted key. And what happens to this place? Silence lingered for several long seconds. Thomas answered quietly without lifting his eyes. The mountain floods everything beneath the lake. Caleb felt cold settle deep inside his chest. The hidden chambers. The workshop. The photographs. Every memory buried beneath Black Hollow Lake would disappear forever beneath freezing water and collapsing stone. Thomas looked toward Elias then, and for the first time Caleb saw fear inside the old man's tired eyes. Not fear for himself. Fear of losing his son again. Elias smiled gently at him. "It is all right, father." The words nearly broke Thomas where he stood. Another deafening crack thundered through the basin. One of the massive support beams above the turbines bent violently beneath pressure. Emergency lights flickered wildly before half the chamber plunged into darkness. Water surged higher beneath the catwalks. Ranger barked urgently beside Caleb now, staring toward the release mechanism. Elias stepped back slowly into the mist drifting across the cavern. "The mountain chose you because you still know how to let go," he whispered softly. Caleb turned toward him instantly. "Wait." But the younger man had already begun fading into the darkness beyond the red emergency lights, his outline dissolving slowly into mist and shadow beside the roaring water. Then only his voice remained echoing faintly through the underground chamber beneath Black Hollow Lake. "Open the gates before the mountain decides for you." The mountain shook again beneath Black Hollow Lake with a force that nearly threw Caleb against the steel railing surrounding the release platform. Water exploded upward through fractured pipes while the roar beneath the turbine basin deepened into something almost alive, a sound too enormous to belong to machinery alone. Red emergency lights pulsed weakly through drifting mist as Ranger barked sharply beside the chained release lever, his paws planted wide against the trembling catwalk while black water surged dangerously close beneath them. Thomas Harrow stood several feet away gripping the railing tightly, exhaustion hollowing his face beneath the flickering light. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the darkness where Elias had vanished moments earlier into the rising mist. Caleb tightened his grip on the rusted military key while cold air rushed violently through the underground chamber. "If I open the gates," he shouted above the roar, "there may not be enough time to get everyone out." Thomas looked toward him quietly. "There is no everyone left down here anymore." The words settled heavily between them. Caleb glanced once more toward the shadows where Elias disappeared. The younger man's voice still echoed faintly inside his mind like a memory the mountain refused to release. "Open the gates before the mountain decides for you." Ranger suddenly lunged toward the control pedestal and barked 3 urgent times. Caleb followed the dog's gaze immediately. Cracks spread rapidly across the massive steel support columns overhead, thin at first, then widening visibly beneath the crushing pressure building somewhere beyond the lower tunnels. Water burst through the fractures in icy streams. The mountain was running out of time. Caleb moved quickly toward the release mechanism. Thick chains wrapped around the rusted control wheel while decades of corrosion covered the locking system beneath layers of mineral stains and dust. He inserted the military key into the ancient release housing. At first, nothing happened. Then deep within the machinery came the heavy sound of gears slowly waking after years of silence. Ranger stood beside him now, ears pinned flat beneath the rising roar around them. Caleb pulled hard against the control lever. Rusted metal screamed through the chamber. One chain snapped loose and crashed into the flooding water below. Another violent tremor shook the basin. The entire catwalk lurched sharply sideways. Thomas nearly collapsed against the railing before catching himself. Caleb looked toward him immediately. "We need to move." Thomas shook his head slowly. The secondary release valves require manual pressure stabilization from the upper chamber. Caleb's pulse tightened. "Then we both go." But Thomas smiled faintly beneath the flashing red lights. "Your father already made this walk once." Water surged violently beneath the catwalks now, smashing against the turbine walls with terrifying force. Emergency alarms screamed through the underground chambers while distant steel groaned somewhere deeper inside the mountain. Caleb felt anger rise suddenly through the fear tightening his chest. "I am not leaving you here." Thomas stepped closer slowly despite the shaking structure around them. The old man placed one trembling hand against Caleb's shoulder. You already carried enough ghosts before this mountain found you. His tired blue eyes softened beneath the emergency lights. Do not let it bury you beside ours. Ranger whimpered softly between them. Then, from somewhere high above the turbine basin, came the sound of piano music drifting faintly through the mist once more. Slow. Gentle. Familiar. Thomas closed his eyes briefly as though hearing something beautiful after decades of silence. Evelyn used to play that song during snowstorms. Caleb turned sharply toward the upper catwalks overhead. Through drifting steam and flashing red lights, he saw two figures standing together near the far observation platform high above the water. Evelyn Harrow beside Elias. Both watching quietly from the mist beneath the trembling mountain. Neither looked afraid anymore. The sight lasted only a heartbeat before darkness swallowed the platform. Once more. Caleb stared upward in stunned silence while Ranger slowly lowered himself beside the control pedestal, calm now for the first time since entering the hidden chambers beneath Black Hollow Lake. Thomas smiled faintly toward the darkness overhead. The mountain is finally letting them go. Another deafening crack thundered through the basin. One of the enormous turbine supports collapsed into the water below, sending freezing spray exploding across the chamber. Caleb grabbed the release wheel with both hands immediately and pulled with everything he had left. The ancient mechanism resisted for several agonizing seconds before finally turning. Deep beneath the mountain came the sound of colossal gates slowly opening for the first time in over 40 years. The entire chamber shook violently. Water roared through unseen spillways somewhere far below the tunnels. Pressure alarms suddenly began shutting down one by one across the underground facility. Ranger barked sharply toward the upper tunnels leading back toward the cabin. Caleb looked toward Thomas immediately. It worked. But the old man had already lowered himself slowly onto the steel stairs beside the railing, exhausted beyond movement now. Water reflected softly in his tired eyes while the mountain trembled less violently around them with every passing second. Thomas looked toward Caleb with quiet peace settling across his weathered face. Go home, son. Then the emergency lights throughout the chamber flickered one final time before the hidden world beneath Black Hollow Lake disappeared into darkness. Morning arrived over Black Hollow Lake in absolute silence. Snow covered the frozen shoreline in soft silver light while pale winter sun drifted slowly through the pine trees surrounding the old cabin. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the mountain strangely calm, as though the earth itself had finally exhaled after holding its breath for far too many years. Caleb Mercer stood on the cabin porch wrapped in Thomas Harrow's heavy wool coat while steam rose gently from the coffee cup warming his hands. Ranger rested beside the doorway near the old lantern, eyes half closed beneath. The morning light, peaceful now in a way Caleb had never seen before. The deep tension that once lived inside the shepherd seemed gone, as if whatever silent burden the dog carried beneath the mountain had finally been released with the floodwaters rushing through the hidden spillways below Black Hollow Lake. Caleb looked out across the frozen lake quietly. No signs remained of the underground chambers hidden beneath the mountain. No vibrations shook the earth anymore. No distant machinery groaned beneath the ice. Only wind moving gently through pine branches and the soft crackle of snow falling from the cabin roof into untouched drifts below. The hidden world beneath the lake was gone. Buried forever beneath freezing water and collapsed stone. Yet somehow the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. Caleb lowered his eyes toward the folded letter resting beside his coffee cup. He had found it earlier that morning inside the kitchen near the fireplace, waiting carefully atop the old wooden table beside a single candle burned completely down to melted wax. The handwriting belonged to Evelyn Harrow. Caleb unfolded the fragile paper slowly while Ranger lifted his head beside the porch. If you are reading this, the letter began, then the mountain finally chose to rest. Caleb stared quietly at the page while pale sunlight drifted through the surrounding forest. Thomas always believed some places carry memory the way people carry scars. Black Hollow Lake remembered every promise ever made beside its shores. Every sacrifice. Every grief. But he also believed kindness leaves echoes stronger than fear. Caleb swallowed slowly. The cabin creaked softly behind him while the scent of cedar smoke drifted gently from the chimney overhead. Evelyn's words continued beneath the fading ink. You were never chosen because you were perfect. You were chosen because you understood what it meant to keep walking even after losing your way. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Memories moved quietly through him then. Endless highways beneath winter skies. Sleeping inside broken trucks beside Ranger during freezing nights. Years spent drifting from town to town carrying silence. Heavier than loneliness itself. He had spent most of his life believing he survived while other men stronger than him did not. Yet standing there beside the old cabin, wrapped in morning light and mountain silence, Caleb realized survival had never been the reason the cabin called him home. Some people are chosen simply because they still know how to stay kind after the world gives them every reason not to. Ranger stood slowly and moved toward the porch steps. The shepherd stared toward the frozen lake with calm amber eyes while soft wind carried through the pine trees surrounding Black Hollow Lake. Then Caleb heard it. Very faint. A piano melody drifting somewhere across the snow. The same slow song Thomas said Evelyn played during storms many years ago. Caleb looked toward the lake immediately. For a brief moment, he saw two figures standing together near the shoreline beneath the morning mist. Thomas beside Evelyn. Quiet. Peaceful. Watching the cabin one final time. Ranger wagged his tail softly. Then the wind shifted, and the figures disappeared into sunlight drifting across the frozen water. Caleb smiled faintly to himself while warmth slowly returned to the world around him. Weeks later, workers from nearby towns arrived to help restore the old cabin beside Black Hollow Lake. Caleb repaired the porch first. Then the roof. Then the cracked windows facing the mountains. Word spread quietly through Birch County that the old Harrow place had reopened after decades of silence. But not as a private home. Caleb transformed the cabin into a shelter for wandering veterans with nowhere left to go. Men carrying invisible storms inside them. Men who needed warmth more than explanations. Ranger greeted every newcomer at the front steps like he already understood why they came. Some nights the old piano melody still drifted softly through the trees during snowstorms. Sometimes the lantern above the porch swayed gently without wind. And every winter, exactly at dawn on the first snowfall, fresh coffee somehow appeared warming beside the fireplace before anyone woke. Caleb never tried explaining those things. Some mysteries were not meant to be solved. Only respected. 1. Evening near Christmas, Caleb stood alone beside the frozen lake while snow drifted quietly around him beneath a sky filled with pale northern stars. Ranger sat beside him in complete silence. The world felt still. Whole somehow. Then Caleb noticed something resting near the shoreline half buried beneath fresh snow. A small silver photograph frame untouched by frost. Inside was the old picture of Thomas, Evelyn, and their son smiling beside Black Hollow Lake during summer long forgotten by time. But now, standing quietly at the edge of the photograph beside them, was Caleb himself holding Ranger's leash beneath the sunlight. On the back of the frame